Now to Malaysia, where the lower house of parliament is voting to abolish the mandatory death penalty for crimes such as murder and drug trafficking. The bills seek to substitute the death penalty with life imprisonment of between 30 and 40 years, as well as caning. Let's go live to our correspondent, Florence Looi in Kuala Lumpur. Florence, this is something that's been in discussion for several years now.
That's right. In 2018, it was actually part of the manifesto of the coalition that eventually won that year's general polls to abolish the mandatory death penalty. But during its 2 years in power, that administration failed to introduce, to reform the laws. And then last year, we had a different administration tabling similar bills. But before they could be debated, Parliament was dissolved. And here we are in 2023, again, a different administration tabling those bills, and members of Parliament are expected to vote on it on Monday. It is expected to pass because it has bipartisan support. Now, the mandatory death penalty, or the death penalty even, has been part of the Malaysia's criminal justice system since British colonial rule, but it was originally enforced for murder. And then when Malaysia toughened its drug laws in the 1980s to show that it has zero tolerance on drugs, it made the death penalty mandatory for drug trafficking. But the conversation around the death penalty has been taking place around the world for decades now. There's been an understanding that the mandatory death penalty is not only unjust because mainly it takes away the discretionary factors of the judge, but also it doesn't allow them to take into consideration mitigating factors like the person's history of abuse or mental illness. So that conversation about reforming the sentencing system has been taking place for several years now in Malaysia.
Vanitha Dawit's husband has been on death row for 13 years. He was found guilty of murder. She's raised their son on her own.
When my son went to kindergarten, he didn't have a father. It was just me, a single mom. When he started primary school, he didn't have a father then either. He's now 16. His father has not even held his hand.
Malaysia is now aiming to abolish the mandatory death penalty. There are currently 11 offences where death is the automatic punishment. Of the 1,300 inmates on death row, nearly 70% were convicted of drug trafficking. In Malaysia, carrying even a small amount of illicit substance comes under that definition. Human rights groups say it doesn't meet the threshold of most serious crimes under international law. The proposed amendments will allow the country's highest court to replace death sentences with life imprisonment and caning.
These reforms have been on the table for several years now, and a moratorium on executions has been in place since 2018. The minister in charge of legal reforms says the abolition of the mandatory death penalty is aimed at valuing the sanctity of life while ensuring justice and fairness for all.
Anti-death penalty advocates welcome the move and say Malaysia also needs to look at reforming other aspects of its penal system, including rehabilitation.
Most of us in Asia Pacific specifically still really prioritizes punitive punishment. We don't really ask the hard question, once we punish a guy and once they come out, what do we want to do with him? Do we expect him to suddenly reintegrate back to society and do good, or do we expect them to reoffend down the road?
For Vanitha, there is at least a chance that her husband's case might be reviewed.
I know he did wrong, but please don't hang him. Give him another chance. Release him, he can change.
The changes will still have to be passed in the upper house of Parliament and signed into law by the King before they come into effect. Florence Looi, Al Jazeera, Kuala Lumpur.
So, many activists and anti-death penalty advocates say their ultimate goal is to see the death penalty abolished in Malaysia completely. Malaysia is one of 53 countries that still maintains the death penalty. So more than around 70% of countries in the world have abolished the death penalty in law and in practice. But some activists, some advocates are very realistic. They don't expect that conversation to take place in Malaysia at least for another 10 years. And that is mainly because many people still see the death penalty as an effective deterrent, even though there's no data to say that it is. And there's also the perception that to abolish the death penalty could show that the country or the administration is soft on crime. So that conversation has to take place first before that's expected. The death penalty can be completely abolished.
Florence, thank you for that. Florence Looi live there in Kuala Lumpur.